Hey everybody, this is Bo Sanders, and today I want to talk to you about the beauty of critical theory, how it examines, exposes, and advocates. For me, this is important, specifically in critical race theory as it relates to whiteness work and my religious faith. But before I get to that, a little bit of background. So a couple of weeks ago, I made several videos about how critical theory will be our salvation, and how evangelicals can't do critical race theory, and it got a huge response, and I am very grateful for all of that. And actually, I'm still sorting through all of the comments and questions and emails and follow-up from that. But one of the things that was really interesting is that people have started sending me other resources, people speaking against critical theory, especially as it relates to faith or religious work. And so I have more material to sort through right now than I could possibly get to, but I just wanted to put forward what I like about it. Now, I know it's not for everybody, and I'm not asking everyone to do it, but it's always interesting to me when people speak against it. So I wanted to tell you why it appeals to me and what I think is beautiful about it as it relates to my fields and my religious practice. So one of the comments that was offered up is somebody said, you keep referring to critical theory as a toolbox, but it's a little more than that. It's not quite a worldview, which I said it wasn't, and they agreed. But it's a little more than just a toolbox. It has an agenda. And they are right. And so I conceded that and I agreed. And I said, right. The purpose of critical theory is to examine, explicate, and advocate. Or you might say, interrogate, expose, and change. Not just explain culture and society. The goal is to actually change it. So I want to tell you why each of those is important to me. So the first one is to examine or interrogate. And for me, this ties into parables and prophets. Throughout the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, you see this impulse to come in with, whether it's in parables, storytelling, or whether it's in prophets, in prophetic utterances or demonstrations, but to try and get people to question the way things are and to say, are you sure that this is the way God wants them? Because specifically, and you can look up, I just did a video on lessons that we learned from Luke, reading through the Gospel of Luke. Jesus is constantly trying to come in underneath people's radars, stay away from Rome, which is a threat to his physical existence, but also for the crowd to get them to question, are you sure that the way things are, the status quo, the structures and systems and institutions of power, are you sure that they are the way, the best way they can be, or the way that God wants them? Don't think that just because somebody has wealth or power that they are blessed by God, for God is working in little things behind the scenes to undermine and subvert the way things are and to bring about a better way of being in the world. Some call it the kingdom, so you can call it the kingdom, the basileia tetheu, however you want to translate it, the empire of God, the reign and rule of God. But the expectation is that there's a better way to be in the world. The first step, however, is to get people to question the status quo. And so you might tell little stories about people they don't respect very much, foreigners, and maybe widows, maybe beggars, poor people. And so you tell these little stories, and there's always a twist where the hero or the moral of the story is not what you thought it was going to be coming in. So it asks you to interrogate or examine your assumptions, your pre-established conclusions. And that's a beautiful first step. As far as the toolkit goes, to examine or interrogate is a perfectly legitimate first thing to do. But the second act is to expose or unmask. And so this ties into some historical stuff like Walter Wink's The Powers That Be, or even Girard's scapegoat theory of atonement. In typical critical theory, at this point, you're talking about ideology, the things that people don't see because they're assumed, right? To expose them or unmask them. And you can go all the way from Jesus talking about turning the other cheek, Well, what that does is if somebody smacks you across the cheek open-handed and you don't hit them back, and then they turn the back of their hand and hit you again, you have exposed their violence by escalating it with non-resistance, right? So that's one example of that. And you see this whether it's in Gandhi or MLK, the power of non-violence. But there's also a move for us in critical theory, and for me specifically in whiteness work for critical race theory, of making visible that which is invisible. So often when somebody begins their journey into understanding whiteness and maybe white privilege, that you would say, do you think you've ever benefited from being white in a job interview or in a police situation or something like that, neighborhood, shopping for real estate, anything like that? And often people will say, I don't think so. I mean, what they think is normal, right? They think everyone should have access to. And so if you don't have that, right, that's a bad thing. But the absence of it isn't seen as a good thing. So part of critical race theory is to expose how the structures, the structurated way that society is set up, whether it's institutions like banks and policing and right elections and so many other things, schooling, education, how it is structured in such a way and that we have to expose that. It's like pulling off the drywall in a house to expose the beams, the studs that are behind the wall, and to expose how the electricity and the plumbing and all of that comes together, because when the drywall is up, you don't think about any of that internal structure that holds up the frame. It's assumed. And so that's what we have to expose. And then the last move is to advocate for change. Not just to explain the world. I mean, the point of critical theory isn't just to write up some phenomenon that you've studied as a case study, right? And there's a place for that. But the primary concern of critical theory is to advocate for change. And so it's not just to examine and not just to expose or explain, but it's ultimately to change. And so this is the thing, is that critical theories aren't just theories. This is not just abstract concepts and big vocabulary words. The goal in the end is to do something about what you've exposed. It does you no good to pull the drywall off and to examine the problem and to walk out and say, I guess the family can just live there, right? You have to do something with what you find. And that's what I love about critical theory. For me, how it ties into my work in whiteness and for faith, is that ultimately I don't want to have theories about doing things or things in themselves, but to actually put your faith into action and to move in a direction that brings about a greater possibility for human flourishing, connection, and the greater good. Beloved community, someone might say. So that's why I love critical theory and critical race theory specifically. So I'm not asking everyone to do it, but I have to admit it is a little weird how many people are speaking against it right now, and specifically religious people, people of faith. So I just want to say, if you find yourself in a situation where someone is doing that, I always want to point to the 3 C's. See if the person is trying to preserve or conserve these 3 C's. Something to do with the Constantinian shift in the early centuries of the church, Christendom, and specifically Western European Christianity, or colonialism. Those are my 3 C's: Constantine, Christendom, and colonialism. If somebody is trying to conserve or preserve something from that era, then you know why they're speaking against critical theory. I would love your thoughts. Look forward to upcoming videos. I'm very excited to be involved in this conversation, and I really want to thank you for your shares and your comments and your questions.